What up, peeps? Part three of my recent pilgrimage to Russia. I'm going to talk mainly about the geopolitical, geostrategic, economic considerations that I experienced. These are based on my own observations, but also based on things that I've studied since then, before, during, since. And you cannot divorce the political from the religious, unfortunately. That's my regrettable opinion. And as I said in part one, I believe that a lot of the animus that is directed by the Western oligarchy towards Russia is because it is resurgent in its Christianity. And I also said that, it's not perfect. There's problems there, just like there's problems everywhere. But it still is an unabashed Christian nation. It's just obvious to me. It's unapologetic. And that drives many of our intellectuals, especially the neoconservatives, to distraction. It really does. So, I want to talk about several things. Hopefully this will not be too long. I have notes. I've tried to make them in some kind of an order here, so please bear with me. And unfortunately I have to use these readers. So, what can we say about President Putin, first of all? Well, he's a judo master. He's a black belt in judo. How does he get what he gets? How does he accomplish what he accomplishes? There are three aspects to the martial art of judo. The first thing is you are patient. The second thing is you size up your opponent's weakness. The third thing is you strike. Okay. And we saw examples of this during the post-Maidan coup in Ukraine, when during the Minsk Accords there were several leaders there, including Putin, including Poroshenko, the leader of the coup d'etat in Ukraine, as well as of the president of France, Hollande, at the time, and then Angela Merkel, the chancellor of Germany. And it's funny, but everybody was talking except Putin. Putin was not saying a word. And as I read from somebody who was there, I can't remember, maybe it was Zero Hedge, Poroshenko thought, oh dear, we're screwed. Because he knew that Putin does not promise and he does not threaten, he acts. And what happened? He seized the Ukraine. He seized the Crimea. The Crimea now is off the table. It's just off the table. So, that brings us now to Russia as a military power, as a geostrategic power. Russia has very limited resources, but they marshal their resources. As I put in an earlier blog, there was a article that I highlighted. It said, is the Russian army better than the American army? It didn't answer it directly, but it talked about the Russian military doctrine, which is to strike, to only take into consideration that which is good for Russia and its interests, and to not spread itself too thin. This is very significant as opposed to us. I mean, the Russian military budget is $65 billion a year. Ours is $700 billion a year. We have well over 1,000 military bases, not only in the United States, but all over the world. And this is the military-industrial complex. This is probably what keeps our economy going, by the way. Anyway, so the Russians are very cagey. They're very smart. and they only do that which is in their interests. Smart. Having said that, the neocon deep state won significant victory with their false collusion, Russian collusion narrative. It's clear that Trump, upon winning, wanted to have instant détente with Putin. And that's because he's a builder. That's because he owns property in Moscow. That's because he's not a warmonger. Unfortunately, the deep state fought back with this fake news, the fake news of Russia collusion. And it's hobbled Trump. And it's obvious. So Trump, unfortunately, has had to put sanctions on Russia, which we'll talk about more later. He's also had to sell armaments to the Ukraine. Still, I get the idea that he's a very reluctant warrior. I read that upon his election, the next day at the Duma, the people broke out in spontaneous applause because they didn't expect him to win. Nobody expected him to win. And Hillary, they were worried that she was just a warmonger. She was just going to continue on doing what she was doing. And the only leverage that Russia would have over her, over Madam President at that time, would be whatever blackmail or compromat they have on her. Okay, which, interestingly enough, that they have no compromat on Trump. That's why they had. That's why the deep state had to fabricate this Steele dossier. Anyway, so as I mentioned in the previous video, I saw a lot of babies, I saw a lot of children, I saw a lot of families walking the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, the suburbs that we attended and saw. It was nice. And I just saw hustle and bustle activity, the cleanliness, the fastidiousness. I saw people going to work. I saw no homelessness except for this one guy who may have been drunk. That doesn't mean that homelessness doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that there are no beggars. I saw beggars. Not nearly to the amount that I saw 2 years ago, however. I would say that despite the sanctions, which caused the ruble to lose half of its value, they've bounced back from that. And they've more or less absorbed the pain of the sanctions and just decided to do what is economically rational. For instance, one thing they do that's economically rational is that they decrease their military budget. When have we ever done that? We've never done that. Okay? Again, this is not a hit to them because they marshal their resources. They know what they want to protect. That's very key here. Okay? Syria is in their orbit. A lot of people say that it's because they want to protect the Christian population of Syria. I believe that. I truly believe that. However, they also want to ensure that they have their naval air station there and their, I think, their other military base. Okay, it's in their interest. You can do well by doing good. Okay. The last thing I want to say about the military capability of Russia is it's only able to project power about 1,500 kilometers beyond its borders. Okay? Syria falls within that parameter. Therefore, anybody who says that they want, according to this neocon mythology, that they want to conquer Europe is stupid. I mean, they're just lying to you. If they believe it, they're stupid. Russia has no more desire to conquer Europe or even to take back the Baltic states than they want to send a man to the moon. Economically, they just couldn't afford it. Okay? So, let's talk about Russia, its economic situation. One thing that we constantly hear is that Russia's GDP is less than that of Italy or Spain, roughly the size of Texas, I suppose. That's interesting. And I know it's, the OECD that puts these things out. However, the OECD, or its parent organization during the Cold War in the early 60s, put out false information that the Soviet Union's GDP far outstripped the United States'. Was this based on false information, or was this a calculated lie? I don't know. But I've got to tell you, not just based on what I saw, but several other factors that we're going to get into presently, I just don't believe that the GDP that is stated for Russia, the Russian Federation, is accurate. Let's consider this. Let's compare Russia to Italy or Spain. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Do either of these countries have a space program? No. Do either of these countries have a space program that the United States is dependent on because our space program is pretty much moribund? No, they don't. Okay. Are any of these countries, Spain, Italy, able to undertake military adventures abroad as Russia has in Syria, for instance? No, they're not able to. Are any of these countries able to develop new sources of to exploit new areas of land, of geography, to exploit oil and gas? No, but Russia is doing that in the Arctic at present. Are any of these countries undergoing a bold infrastructure program? No, Russia is. Do these countries offer free medical services? Yeah, and someday I'll talk about the quality of medical services that socialized countries, quote unquote, deliver. But I saw with my own eyes very good basic medical care being offered, either freely or at a very reduced rate, and very efficiently, by the way. Again, what we consider medical care in the United States and what is considered medical care in other countries, two different things. We have a far more expansive view of what we consider to be adequate medical care, which they do not have in any other country of the world, for that matter. Okay? But if you're talking about adequate, perfectly adequate medical care offered on the cheap, I saw it in Russia with my own eyes. Okay, do they are Italy and Spain operating or running a budget surplus? No, Russia is. Think about this. Russia is the second largest gold producer in the world, and they've doubled their gold capacity within the last couple of years. Therefore, they won't run out of hard currency. Okay, a few more things. Russia runs a trade surplus. It's 2.5% of GDP. That's interesting. They have enormous financial reserves, and real interest rates are higher than inflation. They have an independent central bank. Okay, I'm not so hopped about that. I'm totally against the Federal Reserve, as you all know. President Putin listens to his economic advisors. He really does. That's why he's probably not going to be overthrown no matter how much the West squeezes the oligarchs, because he's in bed with them, they're in bed with him. On that note, I do want to say that there is no upside for the Russian oligarchy to get rid of Putin. Just as there's no upside for them to give back the Crimea just to have the sanctions lifted. I mean, did Andrew Johnson give back Virginia after the war between the states, even though the entire South was nothing but a bleeding ulcer to the Union for 10 solid years? No. Even though the Union Army left with their tail between their legs 10 years later in 1876, they'd had it up to here with the South. The Freedmen's Bureaus, the Reconstruction, and everything. It was all a dismal failure. Crimea, on the other hand, is a gold mine for the Russian Federation. There's no upside for the Russians to give back the Crimea to the Ukraine. The sanctions just aren't worth it. They've already absorbed the sanctions. Okay, that's why Russia can weather these economic storms. Personally, the Congress is talking about more sanctions. However, word on the street is they'll put them out and they'll be very strict, but at the bottom will be an asterisk, and it'll say, per the president's approval. Just like back in '96, the Congress said that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel, but every 6 months the president, whoever he was allowed to stave it off for another 6 months, and this went on for 20 years. Okay, I have a feeling that the new sanctions are going to be along these lines. The bark will be far worse than their bite, and there will be an escape hatch. One reason I'm saying this is because Boeing is in the process of losing out on a lucrative sale of several of its jetliners to Pokeda. Pokeda is a subsidiary of Aeroflot, and Pokeda, it's like Southwest Airlines. It's a lower cost alternative to Aeroflot, and they're ready to sign on the dotted line to buy a couple of dozen of Boeing jetliners, and unfortunately, they can't now. And they went to Boeing and said, "Sorry, I mean, you guys can't touch us. We can't give you money. You can't take it from us. Therefore, we can't take possession of your planes." I have a feeling that Boeing, which I think is headquartered in Washington State, is probably going to lean on a couple of senators in the Pacific Northwest and say, let's downplay these sanctions. I could be wrong about that, but there you go. So the thing to remember about Russia, it's a continental-sized economy that's self-sufficient. The full range of consumer products, from computers to cars, are built in Russia. Ford and Volkswagen, for instance, have plants in Russia. So the idea that they can't weather the storm, or they're hurting, take that with a grain of salt. I mean, if nothing else, Russia is now a net exporter of energy and of water. Water is the new oil, by the way. It's going to be the new oil. Russia is the largest exporter of grain, of wheat, in the world. I just read this morning where the Chinese are feeling the pinch of the trade war with the United States, and Russia is talking about opening up 1 million hectares, or 2.5 million acres, if my math is correct, of land in Siberia to Chinese tenant farmers, so they can get around the sanctions. And this is interesting. It's a great short-term ploy. Long-term, I'm not so sure if it'd be good, because the Chinese could be, those house guests that never leave, and they've always had territorial claims on Siberia anyway. So the Russians got to be very careful about that if they want to bring in a whole bunch of Chinese farmers. Anyway. Enough of the economics. This is going on 20 minutes now. I do want to wrap this up by saying something about Russia, the land itself, and Russia, the people, and it's tied into the economics. The thing to remember is that Russia has been the only country, major country, to suffer two major national disruptions, revolutions, whatever, within 100 years. The first one being the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918, the second one being the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. These were cataclysmic. The first one resulted in a horrible civil war in which millions were killed. The second one resulted in extreme economic privation, a fall in the longevity of males, rampant alcoholism and drug abuse. The second disruption, the Yeltsin years, and the rapacity of the American vulture capitalists was painful. Okay? Say what you will about Putin, he came in and he put a stop to it. And he reversed it. The Russians have long memories. Long memories. Interesting tidbit. I saw recently on TMZ, it was something on with Harvey Levin. I can't remember all these shows. Anyway, and he interviews people, celebrities. He recently interviewed Pamela Sue Anderson, who you may or may not know is a very famous starlet. She was a Playboy playmate and whatever. Anyway, she kind of an interesting character in her own right. Seems to be very intelligent. She regularly goes to visit Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. I didn't know this, but she regularly goes to Russia. I guess she has a house there. She and her husband at the moment, I don't know if it's Tommy Lee, I have no idea. She regularly goes to Russia, and every time she goes there, they ask her, okay, what are we being blamed for now? In other words, the Russians are kind of laughing off this whole Russian narrative, this whole Russia collusion narrative. They know it's a joke. I just thought I'd throw that in. Anyway, I want to end this by talking about the siege of Leningrad. Our docent, our guide in St. Petersburg was a lovely woman named Olga. I'd say she's in her 50s. Lovely woman, excellent English. And she talked about the siege of Leningrad. And that lasted about 1,000 days, 900 days, almost 3 years. And the privation and the starvation that the people of Leningrad, St. Petersburg, underwent was horrible to contemplate. It got to the point where, if you were lucky, you got one slice of bread a day. And a lot of times that bread was made out of dough that was mixed with sawdust. The Cathedral on the Spilt Blood, which was one of my favorite churches in Russia, served as a temporary morgue in which bodies were piled 10 high. The siege of Leningrad, the destruction, the invasion, the Nazi invasion of Russia is inside the DNA of the Russian people. They cannot stomach another invasion, and they will not sit idly by while the neoconservative oligarchy plans the division of their country. They've done it before. Hitler invaded the same day that Napoleon invaded Russia. Think about that, folks. Okay, last thing. The bloom is off of the Western rose. The average Russian at one time looked at the United States, the West in general, but definitely the United States, as this shining city upon the hill. That was true up until about 5 years ago, I'd say. And it's not simply because of the sanctions. It's just that the grand uglification that we are undergoing here in America and in the West in general, the butchification of our females, the soyification of our males, the transsexualism, the loss of all of us, even rudimentary moral compass. It offers nothing to Russian young people anymore, or anybody else for that matter, in the world. I commented in the first video on the beauty of the Russian women. Folks, I'm going to get in trouble with this. I know there are beautiful American women. There are a lot, but per capita, it was unbelievable what I saw there. What does the West have to offer Russia now? Leaving aside the sanctions. A spiritual death? Nihilism? It's think about this, folks. I could go on and on. I'm not going to. I think I've spoken a little too long. I do want you all to pray for our leaders, that they do not succumb to the awful advice of the neoconservative, neoliberal establishment, that peace break out. Blessed are the peacemakers. There's no reason why we can't have peace with Russia. They have no desire for war with the United States. A war which they knew they could not win. So, Pax Vobiscum, and I mean it. 2 Pax Vobiscums here, okay, folks? Peace be upon you. Blessed are the peacemakers. Well, let's try to love one another. Not just us, but those people over there. Not just the Russians, but everybody. Adios.